Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Avalara's update on Brexit. It couldn't be a better day to be doing this, as I'm sure you all know all too well. It's all live. We're getting the breaking news that a Brexit deal has been done, and I've managed to have a quick look at it. It's interesting reading, a lot of stuff going on. So we've managed to get some up-to-date live commentary into the slides and take you through it and give you our first impressions. So in terms of today's presentation, we'll those of you who've been on this before, we'll take the same structure, but obviously it's a lot more updated, etc. For the newbies, we'll do a quick section on how we've got to this position, a little bit of the history, and why the deal that we're all faced with today looks the way it is, and then we'll get into the meat of what's going to be changing for the three key pillars for us, on which is firstly around customs, both the declarations and the tariffs, and then thirdly around VAT and what the effect is of leaving the VAT regime is. And in the case that there is a Brexit on the 31st of October, which is still very possible, as I'll touch on, or even if we do eventually, the UK leaves the EU VAT regime, the customs regime, the single market, as at the end of 2020, which is the provisional date, and I'll comment on that later, then lots of tactics for you to think about in terms of all of those three, the declarations, the tariffs, and the VAT to think about. Right. So here's a diagram some of you may remember we did at March, the last time we marched up the Brexit exit hill for the 29th of March, and it just nicely summarises why we've been stuck where we are at the moment. And obviously, since the 2016 referendum, UK charged ahead in very confident manner and built the Brexit barricade around the 5 red lines, such as blocking the free movement of people and the free movement of goods, and escaping from the clutches of the European Court of Justice, etc. But creating this contradiction, this promise that UK would still have full access to the single market and the customs union. And then the problems were really solidified around the loss of the 2017 general election, where the Conservatives looked to get the majority they needed to avoid the problems that they've got today. And then Northern Ireland got baked into the problem with the joint declaration in December 2017, and the promise that there would be no customs border. And you'll see as we take you through a little bit of the detail of today's announcement, what's been done to finally get through that problem. But then through 2018, we spent a lot of time looking at different ways to solve Brexit. Theresa May got a withdrawal agreement signed up. So the first withdrawal agreement, as compared to the second one, which is being confirmed today, that failed at 2 attempts to get through the UK Parliament. And what that, as our continental colleagues, as you see there, seem to enjoy with fun and exasperation, the UK's attempts to get out of the European Union at the beginning of this year. So after those first 2 failed attempts in March, the EU gave the UK an extended deadline out into the summer. And then later on in March, Theresa May's third and final attempt at passing the withdrawal agreement with the controversial backstop, the insurance policy that if nothing was agreed over avoiding tariffs and physical borders at the Northern Ireland border, then Northern Ireland would stay in the customs union. That failed, so the EU gave us a second extension through to the one we're wrestling with at the moment, which is 31st of October 2019. And at the time, Donald Tusk warned us, do not waste this time, UK. And of course, we didn't. So what have we been doing since then? Well, the thing that we in the UK are brilliant at when we want to take on the big issues of the world, we went and got ourselves distracted by a royal birth. But then once we moved on to that, we got into the European elections on the 23rd of May. And they, if you recall, they're exactly the elections that the Article 50 was triggered 2 years previously to avoid. But we had to go through those, and the next day, as a result of those and the poor performance by the Conservatives and the relative success of Leave parties, it launched 2 months spending time choosing a new Conservative leader when we all knew who it was going to be anyway from day one. And meantime, we spent a lot of time talking about technology that could avoid potentially the no deal physical border checks at Northern Ireland. So then moving on from that, we decided to show the world that Britain was still good at something when it came to foreign relations. But once Parliament did eventually get back into sitting, Boris Johnson had already prorogued, this new word that we all had to learn how to pronounce, and effectively suspended Parliament for over 5 weeks through the party policy conventions. And the controversy of that sparked off the Benn Act, which is going to take centre stage for us on this Saturday coming, which is promising to be a really intense day, and I'll touch on the details of that in a moment. But that essentially prevents the no deal option, which was locked into law by the trigger of the Article 50 two years ago. And then up steps our new star of the whole Brexit process, Lady Hale, who said on behalf of the Supreme Court that the prorogation was unlawful, and Parliament reopened the next day. So we're left with the same three alternatives that we've always had, but we've just taken a step forward on number one. So I'll go through the details of the deal, the proposals as we understood it, but we're obviously still all digesting them because the legal text has just been published just a couple of hours ago. But I think it's worth congratulating the Conservative Party on managing to get this through. You know, it was there was a lot of promises that the EU wouldn't reopen the withdrawal agreement, and there would be no renegotiations. Now, interesting, and you'll hear the Conservatives talking a lot about that over the next day or so. But interestingly, the EU never said they wouldn't open the withdrawal agreement. What they said was, slightly side-handedly, was that they might consider opening it if it was in their own interests. And I think that's how they're going to get off the hook on this. I think what we've also learned is the alternative arrangements were never going to fly. No one believed in them, and that there is a transition period in there, and I'll touch on that, the details in a second. And we will that inevitably will be extended. But anyway, we have a deal that the European Council has today agreed to, and now we'll go into the intense weekend to debate that in Parliament. No deal, which was the legal default position. I always thought in the past week particularly that became less and less of a likelihood, really because obviously everybody was beginning to come to terms with the economic and social effects of a no deal, and trucks blocking up Kent, etc., and shortage of medicine and everything else. But I think what was interesting, what changed it, and still will, because no deal is still on the table, is that the Conservatives have shown their hand with their deal, that the landing stage for the Leavers is an exit from the single market, an exit from the customs union. And I've seen some of the details of the agreement today, and it makes it clear that the UK will not seek to be part of that at any point in the next stage in the negotiations, which is the free trade. So where we're heading towards, I think, and this is my point, this is what we've seen in the past just 3 or 4 hours with the legal text, is we're heading towards a sort of a watered down Swiss model or Norwegian model, maybe a Canada minus type deal. And of course, the Article 50 extension is still a possibility, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Right, just a reminder, it's all about Northern Ireland. We cannot have physical checks on the border there, or the ramifications would be serious. People will die if we get this wrong. So what did happen was, as I mentioned, Boris Johnson, a couple of weeks ago now, beginning of October, did suggest his two-border deal, and that was the Northern Ireland staying within the single market, but of the EU, but coming out of the customs union. And that quickly fell on its sword, that proposal, on the basis that, in particular, the DUP was given a veto over that. And as you'll see in a second, the second Boris deal, that issue has been half resolved. And there was exemptions for small and medium-sized businesses, and quickly the EU rejected that one out of hand. So we've come to the deal in the past week since the conversations between the Irish leader and the UK leader, this dual customs deal. Now, I'll try and explain that as best I can. What's the deal that's been agreed, and it's essentially the Theresa May deal, except they've taken out the backstop, so the Northern Ireland won't lapse or stay rather within the customs union under any circumstance. What's going to happen is, as I say, it's a dual customs regime for Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland legally will be part of the UK customs union. However, it will continue to administer EU customs tariffs, collections, etc., and rules on behalf of the EU. So practically what that means is goods coming into Northern Ireland ports, there will be a customs checks there, and if the goods, any goods coming in will automatically by default be charged with UK rates. Now, if the goods can be shown to be clearly going to a Northern Ireland customer, so for example, if it's a trusted trader, then at the port, UK tariffs, import tariffs, will be applicable. And any goods that fell between the two, where it wasn't clear whether it was Northern Ireland or an Irish customer, then it is EU tariffs, and the seller can, as I say, if it goes to and eventually goes to a Northern Ireland customer, the seller can apply for a refund on the difference. So the point there is Northern Ireland is legally inside customs union and is only a collecting agent, if you like, an administrator. The key question is now, how will that politically play out? The last thing I've seen from the DUP, which obviously holds the key for the Conservative Party to get this agreement through Parliament, is they're rejecting this because they feel it's suspiciously like the beginning of putting a line down between the UK, the rest of the UK, and Northern Ireland. So a customs border between the Irish Sea, as it's often been called. And crucially, the last point on this slide is the DUP veto, which was Boris Johnson's first offer to the European Union. That's been taken back. It's now a simple majority in Stormont, which is the Northern Ireland Parliament. So, and they will be able to vote on a regular basis on the continuation of this dual customs arrangement for Northern Ireland. And very clearly, all the parties, with the exception possibly of the DUP and a couple of independent-minded members of the Assembly in Northern Ireland, will always vote for this deal because it kind of gives Northern Ireland the best of both worlds, I think. Right, one interesting point was, last night, interesting, I got a call from a newspaper that said the negotiations had come to a freeze, and it was all because of that. And they were going to write a headline saying EU VAT broke Brexit. And unfortunately, I managed to talk them down from such a crazy story. But it's worth dwelling on what happened last night on VAT, which is obviously our big interest, people on this WebEx. So VAT, everybody forgot about VAT. I know, terrible. But until the last minute, literally yesterday, everybody pointed out they'd come up with arrangement for customs collections. But VAT needs to be checked at the border as well to spot under declarations and the collection of import VAT. So that had been forgotten about. VAT in the Theresa May deal was covered inside, and this is an interesting point for VAT professionals, it was covered inside the Theresa May withdrawal agreement, And what was going to happen was there was an agreement beyond the transition period. The UK would follow or track the EU regime, rather in the way that Norway and Switzerland would. Now that dropped out, obviously, with the backstop, and as I say, everybody became very alarmed that that this wasn't covered, and this potentially threatened to derail. Now, the solution we found is actually that it's going to get the same solution as customs is. Northern Ireland HMRC, the customs authorities, will act as the import VAT collector on behalf of the EU. So if goods are coming into Northern Ireland, they're destined for Ireland, not only will at the Irish ports will customs tariffs be collected, but also Irish import VAT. Now, the one thing I haven't understood yet is it's not clear that the VAT will be paid to the Irish tax authorities. I suspect not. The way the wording is structured, which is something that was in the Theresa May deal as well, which passed me by, and it does seem quite curious, but obviously it's a concession to get this deal through. Right, so I butchered a little bit from T.S. Eliot, forgive me, but clearly this is a very important few days we've got for us in October in terms of seeing if we can avoid a no-deal Brexit and whether we're going to have any kind of extension. We've gone through the negotiating tunnel, and this morning the European Council agreed a deal with the Conservative government. So now we roll on to Saturday, which clearly is going to be a very intense day because everything goes to Parliament now, and Parliament will have to examine and vote and ratify this agreement. And there's lots of landmines on the way for that. We've already seen that the Labour Party is promising to lay down a second referendum adjustment into that legislation. And also, I think the Liberals have done the same for Monday, and that's in case there are attempts by either party to not have Parliament open on Saturday to review this deal. Because crucially, if there isn't a decision made there, then at the end of Saturday, which is the 19th of October, then the Benn Act comes into force, and that means the Prime Minister has to write to the European Union, the Council, and request a delay. And obviously, as we all famously know, he's promised not to do that, and under circumstances, dead in the ditch, as the phrase goes. Now, interestingly, just before we came online, the Commission was saying that given that this deal has been given, the European Union would not give an extension if Parliament votes down this new agreement. Now, as far as I understand it, this comes from the Commission. The Commission has no such powers, so you can ignore that, even though that will be today's headlines. I suspect it still must proceed, and absolutely certainly, for whatever reason, Parliament does block through the Benn Act or through the next stage, which is on Monday. The European Union, it's a personal opinion, but I would bet they would give the UK an extension if it was clear a second referendum or an election would proceed. Then, just lastly on this this page, the interesting piece, especially for us non-constitutional people or any Europeans who continue to gaze in wonder and fear at what's going on in the UK, the Scottish courts on Monday morning will reopen a case looking at whether the government has correctly complied with the Benn Act, and the Scottish court has already made it very clear that should that letter not go, then they will make an order to the government, to the Prime Minister, to write that letter, that extension letter, and they've already made it very clear if the Prime Minister, for whatever political reason, chooses not to do that, then they'll make a second order within a few hours, so on Monday as well, to a deputy. And I think I'm sure they'll be able to find one of them who would like to avoid some time in the Tower of London. So in all likelihood, that's the way a no-deal Brexit could probably be avoided. Okay, so now we're going to delve into some of the nitty gritty on tariffs, declarations, and VAT. And I've gone over in previous WebExes around this topic. I've gone over a lot of these. However, what I will really try and pick up on is HMRC has been hyperactive in the past couple of weeks on updating some of these measures. So it's definitely worth, or I'll certainly worth tuning in on that one for you. And on the other side, what is probably more worrying or disturbing or frustrating is we're not getting the same reciprocity from the EU 27 tax authorities, which is going to create a lot of problems, as you'll see, for people like exporters. Okay. So one interesting thing that slipped in a couple of days ago was HMRC has now been given quasi-statutory powers to change excise and VAT laws in the 6 months immediately after Brexit. So should everything fall apart, we do revert to the no deal plan on the 31st. HMRC will be able to change a number of rules and laws without statutory permission going through Parliament. So they'll be around processes, paperwork, obligations of taxpayers to submit customs declarations, for example, to pay duties, to pay import VAT, etc. And basically, as you can imagine, these really are just emergency powers to make sure that goods in particular continue with their delivery and there isn't blockages at the port and total meltdown of chaos. And this is like HMRC saying, look, we will write off all the obligations that everybody has for 6 months immediately in the case of a no-deal Brexit. Then looking at the 3 pillars, what's the process for customs clearance? And it's all about a lot of form filling. So all of those, HMRC estimates it's 245,000 businesses that export, UK businesses that export to the EU 27 will have to start completing these documents, these customs declarations to get their goods through customs. And it's a massive leap in the number of documents that will be required. Now, I think the estimate that was shown on there, it's come out from the newspapers in the past few days, that it will cost UK and EU businesses £15 billion per annum to fill in that extra 200 million documentation. On top of that, HMRC spent a bundle of money upgrading its IT systems for that, so it can be so it's absolutely ready for the single SAT, the single administrative document. Right, so moving on to tariffs now, and obviously UK is out of the customs union in the event of a no deal or longer term Brexit, and customs union is obviously about doing away with the SADs, the documentation, and the tariffs between members of the customs union. So there's just an external border where all members agree to collect tariffs on behalf of each other and share the funding between it. Now, what's going to happen on tariffs? And there's quite a bit of an update on that. So HMRC have restated their original policy from the last Brexit attempt back in March, that almost 90% of goods coming into the UK from the EU will be tariff free. So that's close to the position we're at the moment. The big one that was excluded was a lot of agricultural products, and the reason why they were excluded, why certain farmers were cast aside or thrown under the bus, was really the government's worried about a sudden sharp spike in prices of food in supermarkets. But that tariffs, and this is the same position as before, that opening up of tariffs, or dropping rather of tariffs for EU imports, the government is required under World Trade Organization rules, which it will now be party to drop the tariffs on US or Chinese or goods coming from any other country. And as you see there, we reckon that will cost the UK £7 billion a year. Okay, moving on to VAT, so there's a lot of changes in the VAT regime, which we'll go into more details. So the UK drops out of the EU VAT directive, so the UK VAT Act no longer has to follow it, and is no longer subject to rulings from the ECJ. Right, let's go into the details of that. Now, the important point for UK businesses and foreign businesses importing goods into the UK on VAT is that we lose a whole bunch of simplifications. I'm going to go into some of those and update you on a couple of changes from HMRC in the past few weeks. The big, massive one is on the movement of goods between businesses across the English Channel. And currently they're zero-rated intra-community supplies. They instead become imports into the UK or imports into France, and then vice versa, exports from the UK and exports from France or Germany. Now, they become subject to import VAT, and there are some updates on that, which I'll go into the detail in a second. The thing that doesn't change too much is B2B services. That's still zero rated. So if you're in the traditional services business and you're supplying just B2B, then there won't be much changes there. Long term, there might be changes around businesses that provide services as performed. So that's people like exhibition providers and congress organizers. There may be some changes there, but it's not out yet from HMRC what they're going to do. Okay. So now we've got an idea of what's going to change. Just a refresh on some of the tactics, and as I keep saying, what HMRC is doing to help everybody. So first of all, this is a list you'll have seen, and hopefully you'll have thought through something along this. Where in your supply chain, where are you vulnerable to the requirement for customs declarations and tariff payments and VAT? Do you understand? And then as you see working through that list, do you understand whether your systems can cope with that? Can your billing system be reprogrammed for example, any VAT liabilities or customs charges? And are you ready to get those goods through customs? And we'll talk more about that and the progress that's been made. It's interesting on something we don't see enough of is people talking about Incoterms. Now, they're the terms under which you do any deal, any supply of goods, and they express who's liable for the customs and the VAT, and everyone doing intra-EU trade between the UK and the other EU 27 has tended not to include that or not really care who took on the liability because there were none. And what we're finding is people are waking up to that problem and realizing that they're the importer of record or they're due to pay the customs duty, and they're trying to renegotiate their contracts. And there's a lot of examples in the newspapers of some of the larger companies taking advantage of their muscle in the market to make sure the smaller suppliers have to take care of the customs and VAT. And I think that the last point I'd always point out is make sure your suppliers, your customers are aware of all these planning issues too, so they don't get caught out and get your products delayed. So one good, positive, interesting update is HMRC has provided two services where you can contact them if you're having problems over any of these issues. So the first one is a telephone line. You can see the number on your screen. And you're able to call up HMRC, it's just launched last week, and talk about import-export documentation, commodity code type issues, etc. And also the Department of Industry and Trade, DIT, has provided an online service where you can fire into them any questions where you find a non-tariff barrier in another EU country, and they'll give you some guidance on how to manage that. So they're really helpful services there. And a reminder and an update on the EORI number situation. So this is everyone's new favorite acronym, and it's a number that is allocated to you within the EU Customs Union when you're moving goods across the border, and you've simply got to stick that number on the goods so that customs officials can understand who's bringing the goods in, who's liable to pay any import VAT or customs duty. Now, You may have heard that HMRC, in terms of UK importers, were expecting them all to apply for an EORI number, and really up to a couple of months ago, or up to just a few weeks ago rather, only a tiny, a very small proportion anyway, of traders of the estimated 245,000 businesses that HMRC's identified for this requirement had applied. So HMRC now is auto-enrolling everybody that it knows of, and that's about 140,000 of the 245,000 businesses that I keep mentioning. The problem, as you can hear immediately, is those other 100,000 who are micro businesses that are happily buying goods from European businesses, and they're going to potentially come unstuck. So that's a big worry there. Now, the other update, and this is a real sting in the tail, that the EU has reminded UK businesses that if they're bringing goods into the EU, then their existing UK EORI number, whether they've always had one or whether they've just been allocated one by HMRC, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, will not be satisfactory to import goods into the EU. And as a result, you need to have potentially two EORI numbers. You can go to the tax authorities in the EU and apply for one. You only need to go to one tax authority to get one number to cover the whole of the customs union. However, the difficulty is tax authorities won't give you one because the UK is still, for the time being, inside the EU. So a real planning issue there. Quick update on TSP. Now, this is a scheme launched back in March, and this enables businesses, those 100,000 businesses that are bringing goods into the UK, to a 6-month waiver on customs declarations and the payment of duties. So this, again, it's in the spirit of keeping things moving in the event of a no-deal Brexit in a couple of weeks. And again, very disappointing uptake on this, just a few thousand. So what HMRC announced 2 days ago, I think it was, the beginning of this week, that it would auto-enroll over 100,000 businesses, which is good news. Although it's interesting, when I talk to my customs colleagues in this, they're not overly impressed with this scheme, because what the word is about, the analogy they've raised is, this is like your work expenses. You tend to leave them and leave them and leave them, and then you've got hundreds of receipts that you've got to stick into a claim that you can't remember why you did it, etc. So they're concerned this will lead to some bad behaviours. Right, in terms of declarations, I mentioned before, there's some, if you want to do them yourself, you can't find a customs agent, and let me tell you, they are a rare breed to track down at the moment. They're the most popular people on the planet at the moment. Then you can think about software. Otherwise, if you do use a customs agent to do your SAD documents, declarations, and it typically costs £40 up to £100. Unfortunately, it's the smaller businesses, obviously, because they don't have the volume, that will pay the higher fees on that. But nevertheless, there still is help from HMRC in terms of training grants for that, and getting IT upgrades. So certainly think about that. Interestingly, HMRC hasn't been able to give away these allocations of grants because there's been so little uptake on them. Right, depending on your business model, you should think about, look at the different schemes that the UK HMRC operates that could include deferring permanently or just short term your duties and VAT. And a lot of people now are adopting or starting to use HMRC approved customs warehouses, and you can still bring the goods to the UK, but they don't clear through into the UK. Into free circulation. You don't have to pay the VAT or customs. And what we're finding is a lot of chain supply companies are starting to use these, where they used to, particularly Americans and Chinese, for example, they used to use, or they have been using, UK as the landing ports to bring their goods into Europe, and then clearing them through the UK, and then moving them on to the rest of Europe once they were ready to sell or stuck in a warehouse. So to avoid the problems of UK now being out of the customs union, you can use these bonded warehouses. And there's a few other schemes worth looking around to see if your business model fits them. And also, if you need, HMRC offers a great free service where they'll sort out what your commodity codes are using the standardized HS type coding, and they'll guarantee that for 3 years. So that gives you some security over the potential tariffs that you may be paying. But obviously the good news is on UK imports, or on the vast majority of situations, there aren't tariffs anyway. Some other schemes that are about that you may want to think about, the AEO scheme is it's a speedy boarding, as I say there, typically for larger businesses, larger mid-sized and enterprise businesses, because it's quite a hard process to get through. It can take you 6-7 months. You have to go through due diligence with HMRC. It's actually an internationally recognised status, so lots of tax authorities around the world offer this. And once you're cleared for one, you're generally cleared for them all. And you've got to prove to the tax authorities that your warehousing, your security, physical security around your goods, and your security around recording the movement of goods is watertight. Then you'll effectively get a green channel through customs clearance, which is obviously very important given UK is going to be leaving the single market and the customs union. To date, I just checked this a couple of days ago. Of those 240,000 businesses, not even 1,000 have applied. The number is ratcheting up very quickly, though. A slightly diluted down version, another one to think about if you're bringing goods in, if you're not able to go through the full AEO, is the CFSP scheme. It's worth looking again at that. So in summary, you'll be sent this PowerPoint presentation at the end of this call in a day or two. And what I've done here is summarized all the different schemes I've just mentioned against the different business models, so you can take a longer, closer look at which one might be right for the type of business you have. I keep mentioning that export is the worry, and it really is. It's things like foreign EORI numbers, as I've already mentioned. It's things like outside of the customs union, if you're bringing goods into the EU, you have to use specially certified pallets, and they've been heat treated. And there's a real shortage of these, and despite a lot of applications from the UK, the EU doesn't seem to be willing to waive that. And these are the sort of tiny barriers and lack of communication and leeway that I think is frustrating and very worrying. And a particular one that came to light with one of our clients very recently is a couple of years ago, in an effort to simplify EU exports, the VAT directive rules on who was the exporter of record for VAT changed to only allowing it to be an EU resident business, and that was a positive simplification just over a year ago to enable companies to appoint representatives to do the clearance, and they could be a freight forwarder, for example. But the unfortunate side effect with Brexit means that UK exporters of goods, let's say from Amsterdam or from Germany, out of the EU, cannot be the declarant for export, and a lot of not even very big companies, because it could be e-commerce sellers, etc., are just coming alive to that. And we saw that Germany imposed this restriction a couple of months ago, and Netherlands just did it themselves this month. Okay, let's move to postponed accounting. So obviously, as I've mentioned once or twice, the import VAT on goods coming into the UK is now payable if the goods came from the EU. And what the UK launched or offered back in March, if there'd been a no-deal Brexit then, was deferred VAT, we used to call it, back in the day when it was last here, back in the glory days of 1984 when Wham and Madonna were top of the pops. It's back, and not Wham, just postponed accounting, so relax. But what this means is, through a bit of clever double entry bookkeeping in your VAT return, which I'll explain in a second, we call it the reverse charge. You won't have to make the cash payment as long as you can make the recording through your UK VAT return. So it's a significant cash flow relaxation by HMRC. So let's have a look at what this is, and I think this is a bit of a world exclusive. We're claiming we're the only people that's telling everybody how the UK VAT return is going to change, at least what boxes are going to change. So here goes. Here's my best efforts at it. There, those of you that are familiar with UK VAT return, there's the 9 boxes. That's what it looks like today. Let's imagine we've got a UK business or a German business that has a UK VAT return that are acting as the importer of record into the UK today. Then that's the boxes they have to fill in. But let's suppose post no deal Brexit, so let's say 1st of November, if things don't go to plan. What would that look like if the import VAT was and that wants to be deferred rather is £20,000? So voila, there you can see. So firstly, focusing on boxes 2 and 4. What we did there was we declared the import VAT as due in box 2, but we added it, and this is the reverse charge. We added it in box 4. So as you see, box 5 is the includes the 20,000, the addition into box 2, which flows into box 3, and then gets subtracted against box 4. So the important bit to notice here is box 5 did not change. Now the second change to point out, box 8 and 9, the wording has changed and the numbers have changed. And so the old box 8 was all about intra-community suppliers within the EU Union, the value of those net, not including VAT. HMRC indicated in one of its latest releases about a week ago, that now they want all exports to be shown and imports in boxes 8 and 9 respectively. So come 1st of November, that's how you've got to change your VAT return, and that's how you've got to record any import VAT that you've deferred. Goods in transit, still same position. HMRC saying if the goods have left the point of destination over the just prior to the 31st of October and are still in transit through a no-deal Brexit, then the old rules will apply. Moving on to e-commerce, it's the same issue for those of you who remember this. If you're, I'll take you through an example to explain it. If you're, for example, a UK online seller and you're selling to consumers in Germany and you're selling to consumers in, let's say, Poland, then under EU law, B2C is taxed at the VAT rate, and the VAT is due in the country of residence of your consumer. So ordinarily, that would be 19% for Germany. Now, EU introduced this distance selling simplification, meaning the UK seller could continue to sell under their UK VAT number and charge just 20% UK VAT until they hit the distance selling threshold in Germany, which is €100,000, and in Poland it's €35,000. Unfortunately, that simplification goes. That's a real problem now for the smaller e-commerce businesses, because in the event of a no-deal Brexit or any Brexit, they will lose advantage of that, and they'll have to rethink about the bother and the costs of getting foreign VAT registered. One interesting thing that might change, I suspect, in the next week or two, so listen in if this applies to you. The UK is planning to withdraw the VAT exemption for small parcels that are bought by UK consumers, let's say online predominantly, and they're being imported into the UK from China or from the US. So that's a big market, and the goods are under, as I say, £15. Now, instead, the seller will be expected to, instead of forcing their customer to pay the import VAT to the FedEx delivery guy who comes around, or go to the post office and pay the import VAT, the seller will be expected to charge the import VAT at the point of sale on the website. So we're kind of abolishing import VAT, if you like, on those goods under this new threshold, which I should have said is that the new threshold is £135. Anything below that, then there's no import VAT at clearing the customs, the seller should charge it as part of their price. And then the seller has to register voluntarily with HMRC and make quarterly declarations of the VAT. Now, a lot of people are worried this is going to create a nice, handy VAT loophole, but actually a couple of countries have already introduced this. Australia very successfully. Norway's introducing it on 1st of November, and New Zealand is as well on the 1st of December of this year. EU is going to do the same, and really that's all about introducing a level playing field for local e-commerce and local retailers who obviously have to charge VAT no matter what the value of the sale is. Don't forget, if you have a foreign VAT registration, you still, in 19 of the 28 countries, are going to have to employ a relatively expensive fiscal representative type of agent, and just bear it in mind. Right, skipping through, I've got about 3 or 4 more slides, and then I'll wrap up and see if I get time for some questions. Just a reminder, if you are importing goods from the UK into Ireland, the Ireland has replicated the UK's postponed accounting offer, so there is a type of deferred VAT scheme running there. Interestingly, again, Ireland has got to do like UK, offer the same scheme to Chinese importers or US importers. So we reckon that's going to cost Ireland about 850 million euros per annum for the pleasure of that. Just a couple of slides now, moving to B2C digital services, electronic goods. So that's downloads of music, videos, streaming media, online SaaS services, e-learning, e-books, membership to online clubs, etc. Sometimes some types of gambling, plus broadcast services and telecoms data services. Now, in 2015, the EU introduced a really great scheme. It's a single VAT return. It's called a mini one-stop shop, MOS, and providers of those services could just complete one return covering the whole of Europe. So now that's changing. The UK, in the event of no deal or Brexit, and any Brexit, will no longer be able to offer this. HMRC is shutting this down, and the last MOS return, HMRC have just said, will be for Q4 2019. So you will, in the case of no deal Brexit, you will be able to declare your November and December e-services sales to consumers across the rest of Europe in that last return. But after that, you must start completing a return in one of the other EU 27 countries. So we always say pick Ireland because the language, the English language advantage, and Irish VAT system is very similar to UK VAT system. In fact, it's probably a bit friendlier and easier to use. UK sellers ongoing will have to declare their UK sales in their UK VAT return of digital services, and they'll have to go and get another MOS registration, as I said, in somewhere like Ireland. All the American companies that use UK to register for their digital sales across the whole of Europe through the UK MOS. Similarly, they'll have to get now UK VAT registered to report their UK sales and get another MOS registration in somewhere like Ireland. One last one, and then we're done with VAT, and then I'll be able to wrap up. If you do incur VAT in another EU country, so for example, and you don't have a VAT registration there, so for example, you're going to, you're traveling, hotels, taxis, restaurants, or you're at events, you're holding your own promotion activities, seminars, congresses, those sorts of things. Today, you can recover that via HMRC's online reclaims portal. It's called the 8th Directive system. It gets used around the whole of the EU. Again, that ends on 1st of November if there's no deal. No deal is voted through by Parliament, as we've seen earlier, this new one. And instead you resort to paper-based claims, the old 13th Directive. So my planning point here is get those last reclaims in now, because I know some of the countries have already started to refuse to make payments through to HMRC under the 8th Directive system. Okay, just a quick reminder of some of the resources that we make available at Avalara. If you go onto avalara.com or if you go to our old information site, vatlive.com, you can download a guide which covers in a lot more detail everything I've talked about. We work hard to keep this guide, the electronic download, up to date. And so the only thing that it's missing is today's news, that there's a deal in the offing, but maybe we'll wait till next week to see if it actually gets voted through. That guide covers all the stuff I've been talking through. It's a nice, helpful checklist around the customs declarations and the tariffs, and also the VAT liabilities. And there's a lot more ideas on things that you can do to mitigate some of the liabilities that I haven't had time to talk through. But just one last point before I wrap up. It's not all bad news on in terms of the administration for us leaving the customs union. There is some good news to come through. If you've ever in your life wasted 2 hours of it completing an Intrastat, you'll be overjoyed to know that UK leaving the EU VAT regime means Intrastat and EC sales list reporting disappears too. So it's not all bad news from a bureaucratic point of view. Okay, that's very much it from me. Thank you indeed for your time. I'm just flicking through some of the questions that we've had a whole host of questions. Everybody's asking about the implementation period. Now, just to repeat, if this deal that has been agreed today between the EU and the UK, and don't get overexcited about the deal because we've had an agreed deal before. It's got to get through Parliament this week. The wording is the transition period is up to the end of 2020. Now, I guarantee you that that will be extended further because we've got to negotiate a free trade agreement with the rest of the EU, and then only then does the UK genuinely know that what type of regime it will go to in terms of customs and VAT, and businesses will put pressure on the UK government to extend the transition period. And I think it suits everybody. The important bit, the politics of Brexit has been swept aside by the fact that this new agreement legitimately, I think, enables the government to say that they've left the political structures, including the European Court of Justice, behind, potentially on the 31st of October if it gets voted through. A lot of people asking about, can they have a copy of this presentation? Yes, you can, and in answer to a few questions here, then I think the voice recording is available too. That's sent through to you. A couple of questions are being asked about the TSP scheme. Does it include customs are reported for up to 6 months? Yes, that's okay, but there's some important deadlines around that. Same for the upfront postponed accounting. You don't need to make any cash payments in advance. That's the whole. That's the point of it. Someone's asking me, does SAD replace Intrastat? They're not. SAD is a customs document. Intrastat is a VAT-related declarations. So Intrastat does go away, but it's not because it's being replaced by SAD. Some of you, unfortunately, will have to start competing a document called the Extrastat, but I won't spoil your day any further by starting to talk about that. Someone's asking about use and enjoyment provisions. As I mentioned, initially there are no plans by HMRC to change that. I think it'd be actually tough for HMRC to wander too far off the EU VAT directive rules. And this is, if you get time to look at the deal that's been signed today, they call it the level playing field, and there's a lot of pressure in that, and there's a lot of scope that the EU's given itself to allow the deal through today, and to the benefit of the UK government, which wants to progress Brexit, in that a lot of these types of rules, which UK may choose to give itself a competitive advantage over its geographical and traditional trade competitor to the rest of Europe. The UK's got a lot of power to shut that down. So I suspect not is the answer to that question. Lots of questions here talking about will the reverse charge for services go away? No, it won't. The reverse charge sales of traditional services are still subject to nil ratings, so that won't be a problem. I don't think for you. Someone's asking here, interesting question. HMRC's website states that upon a no deal, you may need pay different rates of customs tariffs on imports into the UK from the EU. I don't think that's true. UK, as I said already, UK has. Well, it is true, actually. Sorry, let me clarify that. It's only on that 13% of goods that I mentioned that are outside of the UK's promise to give zero rated customs duties on. So there is a few number of goods that you will have to pay those tariffs on. So it's important you understand what they are. Does the EU intra-community VAT remain as of today? Absolutely not. And that's one of the big points I would call out to you. There is no nil rating going forward of sales of goods between EU VAT registered businesses. And that's the whole point of import VAT becomes liable. The UK has, as I've already said, introduced postponed accounting. Something I should have called out is that quite a lot of the EU states do not have that similar postponed accounting. So you've got to be really careful about where you clear your goods into the EU going forward if they're coming from the UK. So businesses we work with tend to pick the Netherlands and Belgium because they've got very good postponed accounting schemes. Another good example is Poland, but I think it's slightly the majority. The 28 have postponed accounting, so just be careful you don't pick the wrong one. Are the EC sales lists being replaced? They're not being replaced. They're being scrapped, and they weren't a major burden. EC sales list is about declaring your sales of goods and services on a monthly basis to HMRC, and that data is exchanged with other tax authorities around the EU. Helps the governments understand the level of trade between the different countries after the creation of the single market, but also has a role to play in detecting VAT fraud. Just skimming through, I think I've answered there's some repeat questions. One question here, this is interesting, is it likely to be a requirement for UK companies to register for VAT in the EU countries post-Brexit? So I think the big situation there is e-commerce sellers who are selling a relatively small amount of goods to consumers in the rest of the EU. And you recall I talked about the distance selling thresholds, where those that exempted or relieve those businesses of the obligation to register. They're the ones that are really going to get hit in a no-deal Brexit. So it's going to be really, it's really tough for them. Good question here. Is the postponed accounting scheme automatic, or you do need to sign up for it? I suppose you don't have to use it. You're free to settle the import VAT at customs, and if you haven't got a UK VAT registration, you'd have to do that anyway. So what you can do instead, you do have to notify, and you should be able to do that through your customs declaration documentation that you're taking care of the VAT, so that when customs see the goods coming in, they know that they shouldn't be stopped for import VAT. So you do have to notify HMRC in that sense. But then beyond that, as I was showing earlier in the VAT return, you just simply declare it in your return in boxes 2 and 4. Another question here. Someone's just making the same point as I already made. German authorities are refusing to give UK companies EORI numbers even if they're VAT registered. And I think I covered that. That's the problem is everybody has to go through the same clearing database on EORI numbers today, and the UK businesses are already in there because we're still part of the EU Customs Union, which is database. So there would be a situation where the computer simply says no to that. Will a local reverse charge for specific product go away above £5,000? Oh no, that's a good question. So what that's related to is there are anti-VAT fraud measures on specific products which are susceptible to VAT fraud. So that's things like computer chips, laptops, phones, mobile phones, but increasingly products like wholesale supplies, electricity, and gas, carbon trading certificates, anywhere where there's been carousel fraud or missing trader fraud, as it's sometimes termed. So the answer is, as far as I've seen, UK won't remove the domestic reverse charge, as it's termed. So that will that will continue. Again, been asked about reverse charge again quite a few times. Some people asking me to repeat it if I didn't make it clear. On B2B sales of services, the reverse charge will continue. B2B sales of goods, the zero rating won't continue. Import VAT will be due. Another question here, does Intrastat go away? Yes, EC sales list and Intrastat goes away at the beginning of November if there's no deal. So again, obviously, if the agreement isn't approved, then we're in a no deal situation. Just some more questions to slot coming in. If today's deal is approved and we move to a transitional period, does the UK remain within the EU VAT regime? Period. Yes, it does. So from a VAT, a customs, documentation, etc., we are inside the EU VAT regime. We're inside the customs regime. So there's no need to panic or be concerned. And as I keep saying, I fully expect that to be extended, and my guess is for at least a further 2 years. So that's out till the end of 2022. Okay, I'll keep going with the questions because there is an awful lot of you still on the line, which rather than me taking as a sign of panic, you're all enthralled by the deep insights that I'm able to give you. Another question about will existing reverse charge scenarios on services be unchanged? Yes, that's correct. B2B. If the UK leaves EU on the 31st of October with deal or no deal, if there's transition period, current VAT form will be submitted. Right. So again, if there's a deal, transition period, the 9 boxes will continue. If there is no deal, then as I showed in that mock-up of the old VAT 100, the green form, then your postponed accounting goes into boxes 2 and 4. The wording of boxes 2 and 4 changes. The wording of boxes 8 and 9 change from, if you look at it, it talks about intra-community supplies. That then changes to imports. I think it is imports for 8 and exports for 9. So the data that you put in there must include not just what you've sold to the EU 27, but what you've sold around the rest of the world. And so definitely is going to change, and HMRC they snuck that in as a relatively late announcement, and you've got to and maybe if you can email us if you want more details on that. You've got to pay attention to that because the way they've done it is not totally intuitive, I think, and when I was working with it on our software engineers, because obviously Avalara, that's our core business, providing automation. for these for VAT compliance around the world. It wasn't clear that we got it right, and we had to go back and speak to HMRC a couple of times. Just moving on is, again, there's still well over 200 of you on the line, so I'll keep going until either you or me dies a death of Brexit boredom. Is postponed accounting only apply for import from the EU 27? Very good question. No, it doesn't. It applies to all imports, because, as I think I mentioned, the EU under World Trade Organization rules is not allowed to initially offer preferential terms of trade to one or more countries in particular. So obviously HMRC was introducing it for all those 245 businesses that were trading with the EU 27 already, but it was prevented, or it had to open up postponed accounting the rest of the world. And I think I mentioned that we reckon that's a liability or a cash flow loss for UK's HMRC of about 7 billion. A lot of people asking about EORI number, the clarification there. So you can use the EORI number that you have, that you got from HMRC, or the one that HMRC's auto-enrolled you on in the past week or so following their update, but you cannot use it for if you're importing goods into the EU. So in that situation, quite a lot of people are asking the same one. You're going to have to get an EORI number from the EU, and I did say this point, and I think a couple of you have pointed out that some countries aren't willing to give those numbers out. In fact, I don't know any country that is willing to give them out. So that's going to be a bit of a blocker, and you're going to have to be quick on the 1st of November in the event of a no deal. Question here about Northern Ireland. If Northern Ireland's still in EU customs union, then can they sell to other EU countries? Oh, that's a smart question from Andrew. So let's legally be very careful, because we don't want to upset the DUP and disrupt this vote this weekend. The Northern Ireland is not, in this new deal that was agreed today, is not part of the EU customs union. It only administers customs union rules and tariffs on imports of goods into Northern Ireland that are destined for Ireland, including those goods where it's not clear that the goods were actually destined for Northern Ireland consumers instead. So it's just an administrative obligation on Northern Ireland ports to still operate the customs union. So you can hear me very carefully using my words there. So I guess what I'm saying there is no to that. It's the same with VAT as well. So obviously this is part of the deal which has a transition period. So I'm talking about what happens post 31st of December 2020 if there isn't a further transition period. This dual customs deal that's been signed does not give Northern Ireland businesses an unfair advantages. For exporting to the EU, an export agent may be used. Will require only one agent or one for each member state. I think that question, if I may reinterpret it, and the person who just sent it in can correct me if they wish, that's the point I raised about this change in the EU VAT directive of an export of goods out of the EU. As I was saying, because of this change, one by one over the past few months, EU countries have been blocking non-EU established businesses from being the exporter of record on the export documentation. Yes, is the short answer. You can. It doesn't have. If you're exporting from Germany, it doesn't have to be a German resident agent who's the exporter of record on the documentation. It just the definition has been very tightly defined. So you should be okay there. Question is, if deal is done, we need make no changes to TSP is not necessary. Correct. Again, we fall into the transition period, so there is no new customs documentation or tariffs. So I guess if we're all hopeful that no deal is avoided, because it obviously, politics aside, it's got significant important implications, then TSP won't be necessary at all. Okay, I'll just have one last scan of the questions. They're still coming in, but they've mostly just repeating what's already been asked, despite the fact there's still an awful long lot of you. So how long does it take HMRC to process for a deferred account, and is the helpline not overloaded, could not get through? I couldn't tell you on that. It sounds like you're having a hard time with it. HMRC certainly are taking longer than they would hope for, so I'd have to agree with you on that. Okay, just take one last view. There are an awful lot of questions, but I think hopefully I've covered them so far. Just having a last. Will the Isle of Man also be out of the EU in the event of Brexit? Breaking news: the Isle of Man is already out of. It says the EU VAT regime is already outside of that. It's just got an associative agreement with the UK, so that the UK can administer VAT on behalf of the VAT regime. If no deal and we exit 31st of October, we immediately out of the UK VAT regime. Yes, correct. Again, it's the same point I have covered a few times. So sales invoice to EU customers suggested 1st of November would be zero rated. Well, they wouldn't be zero rated. And oh, I'm sorry, I've just seen the whole question. It's a good question. Let me repeat it because I got it wrong. So if there's no deal, and then goods being shipped, being exported to the EU 27, they're not an intra-community supply, they're not zero rated. However, VAT doesn't apply because it's now termed an export, and there is an export VAT. So I'm not sure if I've made that clear before, if I misspoke, but thank you for the person who's pointed that out. It's still a nil rated transaction. It's just termed as an export. Lots of people just asking me to restate this point, just to understand. I'll pick on one of them. Just to understand, does the transition period apply to everything, customs, tariffs, as well as VAT? Yes. The UK remains inside the customs union and the EU VAT regime, so there are no changes to your life. Will Amazon pan-European scheme still exist? If so, how can a company sell to other EU countries from one of the 6 countries where they are VAT registered? That's an interesting one. So those of you not familiar with it, Amazon run a VAT compliance service that supports the sellers that use its fulfillment warehousing schemes, and there are 7 or 8 of them. I think it's now 8. There's another one being added recently. And so what will happen there is the goods, the way it works, the Visa project, is that if goods are shipped from, let's take a couple of scenarios, see if I can get this right. If goods are shipped from your UK warehouse to your French warehouse, it's a B2B transaction, and therefore today it's zero rated, even though you're passing the goods under your UK VAT number to your French VAT number. So yes, that is a very good point. The transaction would have to be treated differently. It's an export. from the UK. As per the previous question, it's 0 rated, and then when it comes into France, there will be a French import VAT to be settled, and I would just have to check what the French deferment rules are like, but ideally you would want to be able to do some kind of deferment as well there. So there's going to have to be, I mean, this is a great question that I'll wrestle with for a few hours, but there's going to have to be adjustment there. So the scheme will obviously come to an end. It's just that import VAT on any sales going, any stock movements between the UK and the other Amazon centres will have varied, and obviously we'll talk to the Amazon teams as well and ask them on Amazon how they're going to treat this, and it might be worth getting a separate communication out from Amazon to them, and we'll see if we can recommend that to them. Good. Okay, I genuinely think I may have covered. There's a lot of people reminding us that EORN numbers are not being granted from any of the other EU countries. So that's going to be a real problem. There's a question here. Let me have a go at it. Do we still charge end customers in Germany German VAT if we are a UK limited company shipping from the UK, but we are VAT registered in Germany? So it's all about where do the goods depart from. So you could record that transaction two ways, I think. The one that you would have you're probably doing today, if you're over the, I'm going to imagine you're over the German VAT threshold. That's why you've got a German VAT number. So you would make an intra-community supply from the UK to yourself in Germany. So you flip the goods from the UK return, the German return, and then you do a local sale to your German consumer and charge them 90% German VAT through your VAT return. Now, then the question is, post-Brexit, what would happen? Well, you've got a couple of choices there. You can either sell from your UK VAT return, and that's that there's no UK VAT on that. Then the question becomes is how do you settle? And this is obviously your question. I'm just catching up with you, if you don't mind. How would you settle that in Germany? So there's a couple of ways. You can either force your customer to pay the German import VAT at 19%, so they pay it at the German post office or they pay it to the German DHL carrier. I'd imagine you wouldn't want to do that. So we would always recommend any decent online retailer to clear the goods through Germany and pay the German VAT on behalf of your customer, pay the 19% VAT, and then you can recover that through your German VAT return and then charge your German consumer 19% and declare that in your VAT return. So sorry, it took me a few minutes to catch up with that was a really excellent question. The one interesting area around that, which I did mention, is the UK is scrapping as I mentioned, the £15 threshold, and it's introducing a new £135 threshold on imports of small packages, which I think would have come under that last question. And in that situation, you've got to register with HMRC for this special small parcel scheme and declare it through a quarterly return. You can do that, or I believe you can still record it through your UK VAT registration if you still want to. Just a warning that the rest of the EU is going to do that too from the 1st of January 2021. And I can already see questions coming in about what I've just said. What happens, great question here, what happens if there's transition period, which I've already, I promised you, so it will come true. I've promised you will be extended beyond December 2020. There's a whole big package of reforms by the EU, really exciting reforms coming in at the beginning of 2021 to, as again, it's a small parcel relief, but also there's the single, the OS, single pan-European return for B2C goods. And I can see a lot of people are starting to ask questions about this. How will this affect a post-Brexit UK seller? So, firstly, if we go into the second transition period, so we extend it out to 2022, then UK still in the VAT regime, as I keep saying, and customs regime. So the UK is still expected to comply with these new reforms. So the OS, as it's been called, and you'll hear about the variation, the IOS, and we've got WebExes coming up for that, so stay registered for that. UK companies will be able to use that through HMRC. So HMRC was going to have to build IT systems to be able to cope with that as well. And then eventually, when the UK does drop out of the EU VAT regime, subject to it all being reversed this weekend with the second referendum or another election or goodness knows what, then the UK will drop out of, it will no longer be it will be a third country, and it will still have access, you e-commerce sellers, you'll still have access to the OS scheme. You just have to register differently as a third country. So it's a bit like what I was explaining earlier with the US or Chinese digital services company that used the UK for the 2015 MOS registration. They're going to have to deregister from HMRC and register somewhere in the EU. So let's say 2021, 2022, when the UK eventually comes out of the VAT regime, the EU VAT regime, then similarly UK e-commerce businesses will have to get another OS registration, one-stop shop registration, to record their payments around the rest of Europe. Okay. One last question. Where an EU company supplies services to non-VAT registered individuals in the UK, what VAT is charged post-Brexit? No further MOS return possible. So because you've mentioned, I'm going to interpret your question if you don't mind, because you've mentioned MOS, I presume you're mentioning digital services which are under MOS. I think I've just answered that, but the UK post-Brexit UK sellers of digital services, they can use MOS, but not their UK MOS. They've got to go and register in, for example, I think the example we picked was Ireland. So you can do that. In the case of a no-deal Brexit, as I was pointing out, you're still allowed to record your November and December 2019 transactions in your last Q4 UK MOS return, but you must be registered, and I believe the date is by the 10th of January 2020 in any other, for example, Ireland, any other EU member state to start completing a MOS there. Right. I'm going to wrap there, even though there is a startling amount of you still online, still well over 100. I'll sift through the other questions, and I believe I can see your email, so I'll answer them if I can. Thanks very much for tuning in. There's a lot of people behind me who helped out on this and particularly scrambled around to, I'm guessing, to be the first people to talk about the new Brexit deal. It's still fascinating. Lots of people are asking what my personal opinions are about it. I'm truly impressed that they got a deal away today, but there is, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's been a lot of compromises there, and the EU is a brilliant negotiator. There's no doubt about that, and they've given themselves a lot of wiggle room, and they forced the difficult issues back onto the UK government, and now the UK government has got to take it through Parliament on Saturday. So it's going to be an immensely intense day. I think the big question is the parliamentary numbers for a second referendum, whether the vote comes in on Monday with the Liberals or Saturday with Labour. The last time they voted on this, you'll recall, it was over the summer. The majority against the second referendum was only 12. So clearly, the DUP are looking very angry. Even it's been an hour since I looked at their last statement, but they don't seem to be willing to back this new deal. They're worried about this dual customs arrangement with that this deal has fudged to avoid physical controls on the border, and that will inevitably bring a few of the more passionate ERG type conservatives with them. And I don't see many of the Labour rebels going over. So it's going to be a lot tighter than 12, I would say. Anyway, I'll leave that to much smarter brains than me. Thank you very much indeed for listening to all this. I can see by the numbers it's been really full house. It's a big issue. We'll try and keep you posted as we go. Thanks for all the great questions, some really interesting ones, some real teasers that I'm not sure I got to, and maybe in our next Bat News I will update you on that. But once again, thank you all for tuning in. If that should not be this interesting at all, it's the note that I'll finish on. But that's the way the VAT and the Brexit gods have acted on us in the past couple of years. Okay, all the best. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.